Hello and welcome to WheresSpot's virtual event. The event today is production consultants. Who the hell are they? What the hell are they? And do we still need them today? This is a WheresSpot Zoom event. If you're not a member of WheresSpot, you should join us. Facebook groups, WheresSpot, or just go to wherespot.com. And from there, you can join and find all the links to our WheresSpot Facebook group, which is where a lot of the activity happens. I'm your host, Michael Porte. We will also be joined by Perry Schaffer and Jonathan Shipman, partners in WheresSpot. They will be helping us get through today's event. Again, today's event is called Production Consultants. What the hell are they? And do we still need them today? Production consultants, also sometimes known as cost consultants, but as one of our guests will tell you today, he prefers production consultants for reasons that you'll learn all about. Our guest today and our discussion is being led by Jonathan Shipman of WheresSpot, formerly head of production at an agency or various agencies, as well as head of production at production companies. So he's production company and agency producer. Paul Mavis has also started off as an agency guy, but became a production consultant when he started Mavis and Company, and he's currently the founding partner of Lakehouse Partners. They'll talk about themselves a little bit more when I introduce them. So without further ado, here we go. Let's talk about production consultants.
So, Paul, please introduce yourself, and then we'll introduce Jonathan, and then we'll move on.
Hi. First of all, I'm so grateful for a chance to continue the dialogue that Jonathan started so articulately on LinkedIn in June. I've been a production consultant for quite some time, so I was intrigued by Jonathan's position, but not surprised. I've been used to it. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to continue the dialogue and hopefully engage in meaningful dialogue with everyone who wants to share. My background, pretty straightforward. I started working in production right out of school on a soap opera called Guiding Light. I worked on that show for 4 years. I joined the Directors Guild in 1985. And right after 4 years of that kind of daytime drama, I thought I would segue to another kind of daytime drama. And I joined a small advertising agency as an assistant producer called Gear du Bois. I stayed there long enough to become head of the department. And then I moved to Campbell Mithune Esty in New York to run the production department there. So in around 92, 93, I thought I kind of reached the top of my career ladder, at least in the agency world. And I was traveling a lot. And my wife and I at the time were planning to start a family. And I didn't think traveling 150 days a year on the road would be conducive to that. So I thought, why don't I become a consultant? And I did. So in 1994, 95, I started a very small production consultancy. And I was fortunate that Lever Brothers was interested at the time. So Lever Brothers grew into Unilever. Again, very grateful for all of the support I got at that stage. We started a company called Madison Advertising Management. And then in 2004, shifted to Mavis & Co., which focused more on production and less about cost. We were more moving into strategy because our clients at the time were L'Oreal and Pfizer and Unilever. They were more interested in, we had squeezed pretty much the costs out of all the production, and procurement and marketing finance became pretty sophisticated at that point. So it became less of a procurement exercise, at least for me, and more about process and strategy and management. And that kind of became more evident toward the last couple of years, when most of my clients were less worried about how much things were costing and more about how can we get more done for the same amount of money, which again led to conversations with a colleague of mine, Larry Byrne, who he and I worked together for close to 20 years, but 15 of those when he was running Dove for Ogilvy, and I was obviously the consultant working with Unilever on that brand. And we started chatting about the current state of the industry and production specifically, both from the agency side and the client side, but also from the production community side. We knew that all parts were not working as seamlessly and effectively as we thought it should be. So that's why we started a new consultancy called Lakehouse Partners. And that's where we are today. So
great. Hey, thank you very much. One of the things that you guys can see is that Paul's had a long and varied career. We're going to sort of try to stick with the things that he interfaces with producers and production companies more than some of the stuff that he's going to do with Lakehouse Partners. But with Lakehouse Partners, you might explain that a little bit later. Sure. One thing that before we're going to introduce quickly Jonathan, give him a little bit of background, but I would like you then to come back and explain the top end. What is a production consultant?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
But let's get Jonathan quickly to, we'll keep Jonathan shorter. Jonathan?
Sure. Jonathan Shipman, as you know by now, I hope. So my career has been in advertising either on the production side or on the agency side. I started out at an agency that no longer exists, which is Benton & Bowles, where they actually had a training program for producers, which is something most people are not familiar with anymore. I had the fortunate experience of being trained under a guy named Jack Warren and a woman who ran the financial side, the business manager, Florence Reef, who were both old pros. And I feel really fortunate in the sense that I learned how to produce, as some people might say, the right way. And so I learned how to read bids, I learned how to negotiate, and I learned how to focus on what it was we were there to do, which was to get the best work for the client and for the commercial. I then kind of rose through the rank at Benton & Bowles for a while, and then managed to find my way into Ogilvy Mather, where I got to work on some amazing work for all kinds of well-known brands. My pinnacle for me there was working on Jaguar, where the final commercial I did when I was at Ogilvy was for a new car that they were doing a single commercial that they were going to use to run around the world. I got the privilege of being a single producer working with two separate agencies, which meant two separate creative teams, two separate account teams, two separate clients, the whole rigmarole. And I kind of felt by the time I finished that commercial, and it turned out quite well, that I had reached a pinnacle there, and I was ready to move on. And fortunately, I was recommended to Peter Friedman, who became a mentor of mine, who Paul knows very well as well. To join McCann Erickson, where I joined as an executive producer. Peter, a year later, made me deputy head of production, which is probably the single worst title I've ever had in my career. So I operated as deputy head of production for a number of years until Peter decided he was ready to move on and join the PGA. And then I became the head of production, which I did for about 5 years or so. And after that, I kind of felt like I had reached a peak there and had an opportunity to join Framestore as managing director. And at Framestore, it was I will just say quite bluntly, it was a real learning experience going from one side to the other. It still amazes me, how little production companies understand about what goes on in advertising agencies, and perhaps how little advertising agencies understand about what goes on the production side. So it was a big, fast learning experience, which I hopefully did pretty quickly and did pretty well. At Framestore, I'll keep it simple. I'd just like to say that the company that I entered and the company I left were two different companies. Framestore's main focus when I entered was visual effects exclusively for TV commercials, and they did film, but that was a separate entity almost unto itself. By the time I left, we had what I call a soup to nuts offering, where we did had directors, editorial, and creative actually. So we were able to do the whole kit and caboodle. We also got heavily involved in VR. We had a early relationship with Magic Leap, if anybody's heard of that, because they have quickly disappeared. And it was funny, I was talking about them today and how after raising $2 billion, they somehow managed to close shop.
If I can jump in now, because we're almost up to date, except for the fact that he's now joined WheresSpot to help us make this even a better place. But I'm going to stop you because otherwise we're not going to get onto our main event, which is really all about, you talked about $2 million or $2 billion. I want to talk about cost. I want to talk about production. I want to talk about production consultants, and I want to talk about cost consultants. So really quickly, Paul, you get really pissed off. Oh, by the way, this whole conversation started when Jonathan wrote an article, which he posted on LinkedIn and on WheresSpot about, cost consultants and how they seems to, tend to screw things up when it comes to letting us get our work done. That's not exactly what it was about, but I'm going to push you into that category because we want to shake this up a little bit. But what we would like to do first is we would like Paul to jump in. And Paul, what is a cost consultant and what is a production consultant? What's the difference, or are they the same?
Really straightforward. And Jonathan, not that we need anything to have in common, any more things in common, but yeah, I spent 3 years on Jaguar when it was a Gear de Bois. So before you took it over, I was doing all of that. So add that to, now, of course, there's supposed to be a lot of friction between us, but we'll just put the fact that we have so much in common off to the side. To answer your question, when I started, I really didn't understand. I'd never worked with a production consultant or a cost consultant when I started my first one. The legacy companies had started back in the day with, Ernst Van Prague and Bourbonnette Stotterman and Minor Raymond. Then there was Art Belair and there was Hooper White. There were a handful of folks who basically came of age when costs were an issue, when it was very difficult for an advertiser to kind of keep track of what an ad should cost. And I was very fortunate to spend time with some of the real leaders in the industry back when Jeff Glassereau was alive, and sitting down with Larry Haggard, at conferences, and they would fill me in on all the good old days of when costs really were the focus, because that was the issue. The process was the process, and the production companies were doing whatever they were doing. And when I started, there hadn't been that transition yet to production consultants, but I had started my first consultancy. I was relatively young and I was a head of production. So I didn't want to go into the field as yet another cost consultant, because I felt it would be very difficult for me to create any kind of differentiator with these other people who've been doing it for so long and carved it. So I just said, I'm a production consultant, because everything I learned at being an agency producer and when I was at Guiding Light, it was more about the process than about the cost. If you improve the process, if you were transparent and you set expectations, I was an AD. Okay, so there was no ambiguity about getting things done. It was always like, yes, what was the question? That was part of my whole philosophy. So my fantasy was being able to knock on the door of some advertiser and say, hey, you're doing this all wrong. But I could never say that as head of production or as a producer. So that's where production consulting kind of started in that regard, because I just had to carve out something to be different from these other people who I couldn't compete with, because they were so established and they owned that territory.
Now, most people, I would say, come into contact with a production consultant when the first time that they meet you, Paul Mavis, was when their account executive said, oh, you got to run your budget by a production consultant. So, and they go, oh, okay. And they talk to you and you had a bunch of information or a bunch of ideas and how to help them get their bid, not lower in price, I think, because that's what you've told me, but through to the client. It's like your job is not to necessarily make it cheaper, I don't think. And that's a lot of the people are asking questions. Well, do you get paid by reducing the price from, $1 million to 100,000? You get a percentage. What's your job when you get on the phone with a producer, are you really looking to solve those problems of cost, or are you trying to get the bid approved? And how does that work?
Right. Well, just so everyone knows that I'm not going to be an apologist for the entire production consulting, cost consulting industry. I've been fortunate that I've been a principal of my own consultancy for years. I kind of set the tone with my clients prior to any engagement, so I wasn't really following anyone's orders to beat up the agency, or I couldn't, first of all, beat up an agency because I was from an agency. So that would be ridiculous for me to say that I know all the secrets and this is what goes on behind the curtain. That wouldn't be much of a business proposition. But if it was an unfortunate situation, if my first contact with the agency was talking to the poor producer who had to get a job approved, it was 4:30 on a Friday. The director was looking at 2 other projects, and he had to get this thing, or she had to get this thing approved. And then I'm like, what? Wait, what was your budget? 200,000. Why is the quote 375? Why am I looking at this? How are we going to fix this? Well, I don't know. We had to do that. Well, all right. Well, now this poor producer, who it wasn't their problem and it wasn't my problem, now need to kind of reconcile this. So based on what normally happens is that we would hope that the production company wasn't told that they had a budget that exceeded the agency's budget from the client, right? So we often found ourselves in a situation where it was the production company's problem to solve. Look, we have this great board. The client only has 200,000, but it's a $400,000 project. So how does that get fixed? So most people who've worked with me know that I probably spend the least amount of my time looking at numbers and looking at quotes. I don't think there's really much purpose at looking at a quote on a firm bid job because I just go to the bottom. It could very well be for services rendered, 1 TV commercial, 300,000. I'm not going to really, unless there's something unusual in the bid letter or the treatment that sets that quote apart from the others. If we're triple bidding, then I'll say, okay, gee, why is this? I don't get it. This wasn't in the board. It's not in the animatic. So I'm trying to have a dialogue with the producer to say, look, we want to get through this. You need to get this thing awarded. I frankly don't care who you work with. Just, how did it get to this point? And I'm sure Jonathan and I will discuss the origins of this friction. It never, ever happens at the producer consultant level. It rarely ever happens at the producer, business manager, consultant level. Most of my issues happened far earlier in the trajectory of the project with the account.
You mentioned Jonathan. I think we should bring him in and say, Jonathan, so I asked the question of Paul, and you were a head of production, executive producer. You filled all those roles. When was the first time you found a production consultant, and what was your experience? And in fact, is that how you see it?
No. And the first time that I had to deal with production consultants, I was at Benton and Bowles. No, actually, I was at Ogilvy, take it back. And we were doing a commercial for Client Doesn't Matter, but it was supposed to take place in Italy. It was supposed to be about tomato sauce maker. It was supposed to be the origins of this company, and it was supposed to take place in their fields of tomatoes.
It wasn't Five Brothers, was it, Jonathan?
It was Five Brothers.
Okay, so it's the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah.
We worked on that one. So.
Yeah, but you weren't the only one. There were other people involved, right, as I recall.
Right.
I consider myself a pretty logical person, and I will argue with Paul that, and he may or may not disagree, that at least I'll speak for myself, which is all I can do, is that I always fought for the budget to be what the budget was. I had a rule as a head of production to never present a client with a budget that was over whatever the client had given for the production if they didn't have a solution that was within the budget, so that it could be up to the client. Do you want to spend this extra money? This is what you're going to get for it. Or do you want to stick to the budget and you're going to get what we agreed to originally? I think one of the things that's really super important for us to define is, what we think about the production process and how we go about producing and where we think there's value. And I've always thought about production as an additive process, so that when I was looking at a supplier, whether it be a director, an editor, a music company, I wasn't looking for them just to deliver a brief. I was looking for them to bring something more than. And when you do that, I find it's the best way. It's the only way to get great work. But it does cause some friction and tension because often it does mean spending more money than what was originally budgeted for the project. So unless I had a strong argument as to why I was recommending a higher budget, I wouldn't. But I always made sure that there was a budget, within the 3 triple bid, which now, by the way, as a lot of us know, there's no longer triple bids. There's sometimes 6 and 7 bids that are going on, which I think is completely outrageous. I make sure that there's a bid that covers, exactly what the client's expectations were.
So did you find that in that, and talk about even lately, that the production consultants were helpful to you, or did you find that you were in sort of head to head with them?
Well, going back to the 5 brothers, the big debate was, where were we going to shoot this? In my mind, the logical place to shoot it, because there were no tomato fields anywhere on God's green earth at that particular time of year where they had ripe growing tomatoes. So it meant that we needed to bring plants and create a set, in other words, on a location. And it was meant to feel like Italy, and the logical place to shoot it was Italy, oddly enough. And there was a fair amount of pushback, not from Paul, as I don't recall, Paul, you having this perspective, and you can tell me I'm wrong. But there was somebody from his group who wanted me to shoot this thing in Australia. Now, there was no reason to shoot this thing in Australia. There were no particular areas in Australia that felt like Italy. There were no fields of tomatoes growing in Australia. And there was, at the end of the day, there was no cost savings because we bid it out both ways. And I just remember, as a very young producer, sitting in one of those really old school conference rooms with myself and 30 other people, having to debate with a group of them about why Italy was the right place to go.
Right. And that was what we eventually
did.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It made all the sense in the world. John presented a very, very coherent case, and there were issues among the client because the product wasn't actually made there, and we were creating this fictitious kind of thing. So it worked out, and we did 2.
You mean we were lying in advertising?
It wasn't so much that. It was just sort of an exaggeration. Let's put it that way. But that was early days when we were kind of getting our clients to reconcile the issue of shooting abroad. It hadn't really caught on.
It was pre-08.
Yeah. So, but Jonathan brings up a really good point, and it's one that everyone should hear on the call. What he said earlier about the producer's responsibility, he takes that on seriously. He wears that seriously, like a professional. And that also, when we worked together when he was at McCann, obviously our careers kind of interlinked. So we had the benefit of working together among different agencies, different clients, and for years. And one thing that's been consistent with Jonathan is that there was a professional responsibility that exuded, and his colleagues appreciated that. So I didn't get to see all the battles he had to fight to get his point across. So he was going to do the right thing. But what I've seen is it's a rare thing these days. And he mentioned that there was a training thing in betting and bowls. Yeah, that's something we all kind of feel sad about, that there isn't that kind of training, that producers are thrown into it, or content integrated producers, however they're called today, are thrown into some of these projects without the support of their colleagues. So that's why we were able to get through this. But, from a cost consultant standpoint, the objective was always never to cut the cost just for the sake of cutting the cost. It was always being thrown into a situation where the costs were coming in higher than the budget that was specified in the brief. And so it shouldn't be the client's issue. It shouldn't be the producer's issue. It should be the creative team's issue, working with the account team, saying, hey, so 90% of the friction in my career hasn't been with the producers or the business managers. Usually it was because it kind of ended up in that moment, but it could have been solved months before during the briefing and the creative development phase. So I don't think any producer would argue that they would love to be involved sooner to be able to influence the whole arc of the project. So why are we testing a commercial that's going to be $300,000 more to produce than the client has to buy? Well, we have to sell something, so we've got to. All right, well, should we tell the client that this one ad that he's just going to sign off on, that we're going to test in front of consumers and get all this research, is going to be $300,000 more than his budget? Wouldn't that have been a good conversation to have? So I don't think I've ever had a conversation with the producer where we disagreed that, yeah, okay, we're in it, we're rolling up our sleeves, we've got to solve this. But that was never the problem. I mean, they were trying to solve problems.
That's a really good point. And Jonathan, if you're being told to bid a production, but you're $300,000 over budget, so whose responsibility is that? Is it, is that why production consultants came up, because people weren't paying attention to the budget? Was it an agency issue, or do you think that may have helped create that?
No, actually, I don't. At the end of the day, I think, and Paul, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, but my take has always been that production cost consultants, and because production consultants is an evolution. So let's start at the beginning with cost consultants. The reason cost consultants became a factor in production was because in the early days, nobody knew really what was going on and really understood the process of making a TV commercial.
Right.
And there is no doubt that production companies and perhaps some creatives took advantage of that lack of knowledge and that ignorance to be able to sell through things that were unnecessary or charge at a rate that was exorbitant. Back in the day, the markup was 35%, and if you look at today, what the markup generally is, when I left Frame Store, we sometimes were doing things for 7% markup, 10% markup, and so things had swung the opposite direction. It's what started cost consultants was an abuse of the opportunity, and there were companies which will remain nameless who, blatantly overspent and took advantage of the situation, took advantage of the ignorance. And so, can I just finish one thing, Michael?
Sorry, yeah, please.
Agencies could have resolved this in a really simple manner, which was we had the manpower and the capabilities to be able to bring that under control. We didn't. And when I say we, I mean the global agencies in general.
I think it was you.
Yeah, it was me specifically. We didn't publicize that. I was, as I said, I was fortunate to work with somebody like Florence Reed, who was one of the best negotiators that I've ever worked with in my life. And she would negotiate somebody to the ground, wrestle somebody to the ground. So we had the capabilities. We didn't do a good job of promoting it. And I think that was what opened the door for cost consultants.
Absolutely. I'd agree with that totally. And I think that part of that dynamic has always been because production has always been a peripheral part of the agency, advertising agency structure. I always felt that I was simply a supplier to my own colleagues. I never felt fully integrated, except when I had to do a reel for a new business pitch and I was allowed to be in the room because if someone needed to press play, but I never felt that well received. I was always the production guy, even when I was a vice president, head of production. So I think that was a huge problem because, and we've talked about this, Jonathan, when, a client comes in for a pre-bid meeting or a creative presentation, there's the account person who she's seen 100 times and the creative person who she's seen 100. All of a sudden we have this new producer. Who's that? Oh, that's the producer. What happened to Joe? He's not around for this. We're just going to bring this one. Okay, great. So all of a sudden that role is a bit devalued because there's no consistency. And there hasn't been, nowadays more producers are realizing, no, I'd like to be that person to do every single one of these. It's less about their reel now, more about their checking account, which is understandable. But what I found is that there's a dilution of the impact a producer has in these discussions, and therefore the client's perception of what a producer does. And that's a shame because I know damn well the producer's contribution is essential I am a big, unlike some of my competitors, and, I think there's maybe more of a thing. I'm a big recoupler. I don't believe creative should be decoupled from an agency. If they created it, they're responsible for delivering it. Now, there's certain tactics that they may not be, the best for, but at the end of the day, they have to deliver the work. So I agree with you that there was a time when cost consultants might have come in simply because there was no structure around it. But when I came up, the costs were pretty much defined. And I guess now we're seeing with procurement and marketing finance becoming sophisticated, there's not a lot of room to maneuver around a budget anymore. I just wish that more account people would not allow the work to commence unless the budget was specified and the deliverables were specified in the brief. That's not the producer's fault, So I've got some ideas how to solve it, but and I do think production consultants are evolving. You look at from how it started, and you look at where APR is today, for crying out loud. I mean, it's a very sophisticated proposition there. I've got great respect for what Jillian's built over the years with her team is outstanding. So there's, I think that there's a tremendous, that there are things for consultants to tackle. I think that costs are probably not where they should spend most of their time. I think that most clients are aware of that as well, these days at least.
So are there some, people have asked, are there some red flags? Are there some places where people should be aware that you're looking at to say, these are places where costs are, run rampant, like set design or something like that, or location. And in addition to that, when I asked that question, is there you talked about percentages. Jonathan talked about, it used to be 35%, then it went down to 25, then 20, 18, and 20. Is there a markup percentage that they should be aiming for?
So some clients have actually, we've talked to some clients looking to create that level of rigor and, cap markups, cap directors' fees, go in, have preferred vendor. I don't like to play in that area because the more a client tries to influence that, then they become more accountable for the work. And no client really wants to be accountable for the work. They still want to blame the agency for anything that goes south. So my feeling is withdraw from those kinds of maniacal, obsessions about markups and stuff. Look at the bottom line. It's a firm bid. And again, I'm just talking firm bids. Do I really know how much that camera package is going to cost, or whether the art department is going to be this and who's going to be shuffling? It's not relevant. It's like, are you agency? Are you able to deliver the work at the quality standard that we're setting out to do on the schedule that we've agreed for this budget? If the answer is yes, you can shoot it with your brother in the basement with your iPhone. Frankly, that's how we usually approached it. But as in time, when a lot of my clients shifted from being the brand management group and the CMO to more the chief procurement officer, and we were sort of relegated to the purchasing team as an extension of their procurement department, that's when I made the shift going, okay, this isn't where I'm conversational in procurement. I'm not fluent, and a lot of my co-production consultants have become really good procurement consultants with a specialty in production. I couldn't get that good. So that's where I think that, again, getting back to the cost issue, most agencies shouldn't even worry about that. That shouldn't be an issue anymore. The budgets are set. The work should be created to the budget. If, as Jonathan said, you want to propose something to the client, like upgrade to the platinum version for another $100,000, this is what you're going to get, and this is why it's worth the investment, then great, present it. That's what we count on our agencies to do, but don't come in with just this is the take it or leave it, and it's $100,000 over budget with no real rationale. Will you, as a cost consultant, as a production consultant, help that conversation along? Will you go back with them to the client and say, hey, it's another $100,000. Yeah, it's not in your budget, but I understand why it's that much more, and here's. Absolutely. We would have that conversation ideally as early once before the boards get, and this was back in the day when it was mostly, TV commercials, but this happens with all sorts of content, even if we're just shooting 12 recipe videos and we need to figure out what that's going to cost, right? So, but back in the day, before we tested an ad, we needed to know what the full up was going to cost, or else why would we spend $30,000 on an Automatic, another $30,000 putting it in front of consumers, right? And then God forbid it scores well and it gets route it up to the CMO and he wants to produce it or she wants to produce it and we can't afford to do it. That'd be ridiculous. And the agency would look crazy. So we would have conversations up front going, how are we going to get through this? All my job was to make sure the agency looked as good as possible so I would not have to get into an argument or a fight. There were times, though, that it did get down to a point where people didn't necessarily understand that they were hurting themselves. I mean, maybe every agency person on the call might admit that sometimes they sabotage their own best efforts, not the individuals, but other people. And again, sometimes I have to point to the account team. Sorry for those account people on the call, but sometimes they could, no matter what we were putting together, sometimes just not present it to the client so they could sell it. And our goal was to kind of get this thing sold because we had other things going on. Again, I wasn't attached to the work like my agency colleagues were. We had a bunch of stuff. It was like air traffic control at JFK. I just had to get a plane in and another plane out. And that's why I wanted to automate as much of this as possible. So spending 3 days working on a quote was not the best use of anyone's time.
Great. I would like to bring Jonathan back in with a couple follow-ups to that. And one of them is people are asking, Jonathan, when you were, the agency has a particular relationship with the production consultant, but how about the production company when you moved over to Framestore or any of those other companies? Did you deal with these same issues or did you deal with them through the agency?
Oh, well, it was always the agency that generally spoke for the production company. I mean, that's just the way the relationship worked. It worked when I was a producer and it worked when I was on the production side. There were times when the agency would ask somebody from the production company, particularly because I was involved in visual effects, which requires a specific set of knowledge and expertise to explain something. But other than that, it was up to the producer to handle the communication. And so usually it was a phone call from the producer, or I could be the producer making the phone call saying, I've gone through the bid with the cost consultant. In this case, we really are talking about cost consultants and not production consultants. And they would have their list of issues. And typically, by the time, right before I moved over to the production side, it had gotten to the point, there was no point in arguing about it. It was just, these are what the things that we need to take out. And that's what the production would do for the most part.
So,
sorry, Mike.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to suggest that we keep on going back and forth with production consult. They're one and the same now. No, there aren't any cost consultants, and every cost consultant is a production consultant. So that's become the
except Paul, let me just push back just a little bit, because you may be right that people consider themselves both production consultants and cost consultants, and we can singularly call it a single thing, except that there are, whatever you want to call them, there are those who understand production. And like yourself, I've always considered, just so you guys know, Paul and I are actually friends, and we've always had a good working relationship, and I respect Paul deeply. But Paul understood the process of production, and his goal, at least in my experience, was not necessarily to get the cheapest production, but to make sure that that the client was getting value for their dollar, and getting what it was that they set out to get, that the agency had promised them to get. Mm-hmm. So what's my point? It's just that there are those production people, consultants or otherwise, who help the client understand the process. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's where they do the most good. And there are those who focus on the dollar. And it's all about, see, I saved you $10 on this line.
Right.
And the two do exist, Paul. Yeah, I mean,
well, absolutely. But I think that every production consultant out there would look to the remit that they've agreed with their client to say, what do you expect from me? And here's where I find it, when, we were talking earlier about the first interaction between a consultant and an agency would be when the producer has to get a quote approved. The client can say, look, I don't really care about the quality. I don't really care about the agency. I don't care about burning any bridges or the relationship. I just want to save 10% moving forward on what we spent last year. If they were able to even say that, because not many clients actually know what they spent on production last year. So it would take 3 months of a consultant's time, thank you very much, to go in and do an analysis and say, what was your production spend last year? Why would you think you're going to spend it next year? Well, if you produce the exact same portfolio of ads with the same agency, yeah, we might be able to refine it. But every job we do is basically a prototype. There is no way to go back and say, oh, well, now we can do this one for less because now we have all this experience. I mean, I worked on a soap opera. Okay, it was the same bloody thing every single day, same studio, same cast, same crew, same set, same wardrobe. And even then, it was a little bit hard to kind of commoditize, right? So doing any kind of branded content is definitely not going to be commoditizable. But so I think that most production consultants will call themselves production consultants, but there's going to be an emphasis on what we are going to do in this engagement. This client is more procurement driven. They don't care about the quality. The brand team is going to manage that. All you need to do is make sure we don't spend more than X. Now, there are advertisers out there who don't have consultants who commoditize this and come up with brilliant ways of streamlining costs. The simplest way is simply by giving the agency a budget and sticking to it. That's the simplest way to keep costs down. Okay, here's $300,000, come up with an ad, do your best, and then, I'll see you at the rough cut. I mean, that's kind of the dream idea. But, and maybe it's going to get to that point because I don't see many clients putting up with this process and this model for much longer.
I think it's interesting. I'm going to ask you both to address this because there's a lot of, about probably half of the people, a little bit more than half of our other people joining us are production company. And all they hear, if I can speak for them, speak for you guys out there, they hear, sorry, the production consultant, the cost consultant told me that it's way, our set design is way too high. I'm going to have to, cut that by 20%. That's all they hear. And so they're, going, God, those damn cost consultants. And then they don't get the job. Right. And so they're thinking, shit, man, I should have could I have taken it down anymore? And the reality, because I've worked also on both sides, production company and also as an agency producer, it had nothing to do with the budget in the end. It had to do with who the agency wanted to work with. And they've sort of helped force those numbers in the right direction.
Michael, I'm going to interrupt you there because I think that's one of those great misnomers that are out there that is, for the majority's sake, a mythology. And it's a mythology that's become accepted, but I don't believe it's correct. That I know for a fact, because I've actually gone into productions where we were leaning towards a specific director. But after we did a series of phone calls with the directors, he ended up becoming our last choice, as a matter of fact. And at the end of the day, what both the creative team and the producer want to do is come away with the best commercial possible, not necessarily to win an award, which is the other misnomer out there, but to make a commercial that has efficacy, that actually works. Because at the end of the day, what is our role? Why do we make TV commercials? So people watch them. Why do we want people to watch them? Because we want people to buy the product. And if we don't make something that entices the consumer to buy the product, then we failed at our job, regardless.
Okay, good point. Question from the audience out there. How many cost consultants, production consultants are there, and are they on every job these days? Or are they just the big brands? Paul, you probably know a little bit more about this. I mean, it's little companies probably don't have them, but
you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised. Someone who joins a small company from a Unilever or L'Oreal or a bigger organization says, "Gee, I really need some help." So, because I've worked with so many of these big multinationals over the years, these individual clients leave, and they're feeling somewhat adrift when they're the only marketing person in an organization. So smaller operations come in. But again, part of what, we'd want to do is basically meet with their agency first to say, hey, you might not know this, but your client just asks us to step in and kind of oversee this project or be a part of this project, how do you usually work? Because we don't have a manual to like dump on some poor producer's desk. It's like, well, and we come up with a way that works for that client, for that project and that engagement. So there may be 20 or 30 production consultants out there in various sizes. You've got the legacy ones that have been around for 30, 40 years. And you've got a bunch of other mid-sized ones out there. There are a lot of independents, just average people who are just doing great work with their clients, and they've got a nice relationship. So I don't think every brand necessarily has one or needs one. Some organizations have no external consultants. As we know, they've developed really robust, sophisticated internal systems, whether it's with their own internal studios or they've got a person with the authority to integrate with the marketing teams and actually has the authority to sit there and guide that process, on behalf of the organization. It's not an enviable position. It's always nice for me to be able to leave. If I had to go to Christmas parties with people who I was actually, trying to hem in, because most marketing people want to spend a lot of money too. So it's a very interesting dynamic. So we've seen it all, and we've been brought into organizations and with the clear mandate. Look, you're not going to touch anything. Just give us take a look around and tell if we're doing okay, fine. But that's what's happening right now in my experience, that there's just become such a level of sophistication in the process. And I just don't think, again, going back to the cost issue, I really don't see that being the big deal anymore. I really don't. I could be mistaken, but in my experience with the clients I talk to, and the things we sort of almost like turn down because clients come to us for that, and we're like, well, we could do that, but let's start further upstream. We don't necessarily want to be in every pre-bid meeting. We don't want to be part of it was great for the time I was with Unilever because we were kind of just building that. But, they gave me a year's warning before they said, we're cutting you loose. You and all of you guys are basically being cut loose. We want to do it ourselves. That was pretty fair. It was a 17-year run, so I cannot complain, but I could, but why bother? But we knew that was going to happen. And so when you've got big advertisers saying we could manage this, when we were sad, and we took a hit, all of us, not just my group in America, but everyone around the world. But we felt pretty good that we left them in a good enough spot to kind of manage this stuff. So there are a lot of ways to get this job done without having a cost consultant around.
Great. I think that's one of the things I'm learning from this conversation. We have about 5 minutes before I want to take some, if anybody wants to join with some questions, and there are some in the chat. But Jonathan, you want to give a little sort of a wrap up thought and your perspective of what Paul just.
Well, I specifically want to talk about is what motivated me to write the piece that I wrote.
And I was gonna hope you would do that because I have a comment on that too before we close too. So,
and again, I'm actually going to say that Paul is one of the few people who I think kind of delivers on what my vision of what a production consultant could be doing.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, the goal, regardless of whether you're the agency or the client, is to create a commercial that's going to sell a product. And the agency and the client together, hand in hand, go through sometimes 6 months to a year's worth of testing and developing before we actually get to shoot a darn thing. And so once we get to the shoot, the money, the time, and the effort would best be spent if the communication between the client and the agency was as crystal clear. And if the big hiccup that I personally see, where I think there's a real opportunity, is to train clients, and I do mean literally train clients, on how to be good clients on a shoot and through the shooting process. Because what I find, not just with clients, and I'll admit there are some creatives who operate this way, is that they don't really start paying attention when it comes to production until the camera starts rolling. And that is probably one of the most destructive aspects of producing or the making of a TV commercial that you could have. because what we should be spending time doing is delivering on what everybody has agreed to up front. And there's every opportunity, whether it's in the testing phase, in the briefing phase, particularly in the pre-production phase. That's where clients could ask as many questions as they want. And as a matter of fact, I'll use as an example, I worked for one of your old clients. I can't believe it's not butter. One of the last commercials I did for McCann Erickson. We literally had an 8-hour long pre-pro for one commercial. 8 hours. And the client asked every question that he could possibly ask and made up every scary scenario that he could possibly think of that we had to respond to. Now, on the one hand, it was incredibly annoying and incredibly frustrating, and it was felt in some ways a waste of time. But on the other hand, when we got to the production and we were actually shooting and something would come up and he was about to say, but all I had to say was, we talked about this as the pre-pro and this is what you agreed to. And lo and behold, he actually lived to what he had agreed to at the pre-pro. So I think there is this opportunity, because production is not something that people are born knowing. And there's something that I personally believe in, that there's true expertise out there. There are directors who are directors for a reason, because they've studied filmmaking and they understand the art of filmmaking. You know, there are writers who are copywriters because they've studied writing and they've been writing. And the majority of writers that I got to work with, you know, had been doing it for a long time and were pros at what they did. And the main point I'm trying to make is that I do believe in expertise. And I think there is a difference between what a copywriter might say is a good piece of copy and what a brand person might consider a good piece of copy on the set. And I think production consultants, if they really, really wanted to help the process, they would spend more time working with their clients and helping them understand the process of production and understanding the value of a calendar. Calendars is a great example. They're not arbitrary. They're put together in a very specific way because we have very specific dates that we have to hit in order to deliver a commercial on a date that the client has booked their media time. And particularly when it comes to visual effects, which obviously is what I spent my last 7 years doing at Frame Store, there were specific dates that had to be hit and specific decisions that had to be met, that once that decision was made, that if the client a week later decided to change their mind, it wasn't simply just changing their mind. It meant going back 7 days or more to undo what we had done to redo it. And my experience that a lot of clients don't understand that process. So that was what motivated me in writing the piece, was that I believe that, I think agencies could be doing it if and again, Paul mentioned account people, and unfortunately they're not here to defend themselves, but I think a lot of agency account people are afraid to let producers have direct contact with clients. And my experience over the years has always been, when I was able to speak directly to a client, it was always a much better production, and we always ended up with a much better product. But for a variety of reasons, and none of them I think justified, a lot of account people are very protective of that territory. Great. So, you know, it would be nice and very productive is if agency producers and production consultants could partner together to both, because we both have a group of people that we need to corral. You know, it's like corralling, what we used to call it corralling cats, right? They're sort of, you can sort of guide them in a direction, but you can't quite force them into a direction. But if we work in conjunction with each other and had clear communication with each other, and if our goals were the same, which is to make the best commercial possible for the money that was allotted for that commercial, and I'm just kind of being old school calling it a commercial because we make so much more than commercials now. Yeah. The whole process and the quality of what we would get and the amount of materials that the client would end up with would be substantially better and more.
Right.
And that's where I think there's a real opportunity.
Great. I'm going to ask Paul to sort of wrap it up, and then we're going to give
Sure.
people a chance to ask a question.
Real simple, because I know where I was mentioning self-sabotage on the agency's part, you in the paragraph that you wrote, which really caught my attention, what kills me more than anything else is that cost consultants could be contributing positively to the process. It would take a willingness to speak truth to their clients, to point out how their clients' internal processes, their indecisions, changing of minds, and missing deadlines that were clearly laid out in the production schedule negatively impact on the budget. More importantly, cost consultants should be coaching clients on how to be good partners during the production. So if you took that paragraph and replaced cost consultants with account people, you would then establish a direct relationship with the client and the agency who is shepherding the project to fruition from start to finish. You would eliminate the need for a cost consultant because the client would have confidence that the agency will deliver on the promises set by that account person. So to your point, account people don't necessarily want to summon up the courage to face their client and deal with their client. They certainly don't want to put a producer in front of the client to do what you just described would be very essential. So therefore, you have a production consultant, this unbiased third party to walk in there and mediate this ever-widening chasm between the risk-taking an agency wants to do and the risk avoidance a client wants to do, right? So where the role we play is building this bridge between this ever-widening chasm because there's so much doubt, so much suspicion, and no real, and again, just tying back to what the production community is enduring. Every production company, post company, graphic designer, composer, everyone out there who's just trying to stitch together a cohesive picture of what the hell they're being asked to do. What's the real budget? How much do you really have to, spend? How come I don't have this information? This conference call isn't giving me, who am I bidding against? Do I really have a shot at this? All of the stuff that we found almost, it's hyperbolic, but criminally negligent to then toss on the production community. And I'm very close with AICP. So I hear it from both sides, much like you, Michael, where I'm stuck in this whirlwind of like, what about payment terms? How come you don't blame the client. The client paid the agency. Agency's holding it for 70 days because they've got some new business stuff they're working on.
Whoa.
You know what I'm getting at, though. You know what I'm getting at, Jonathan.
But
you're not an apologist for agencies either.
I'm not an apologist for agencies, but if I'm not mistaken, there are companies like General Motors, as an example.
Well, General Motors, we have A, B, and B, but agencies agree to those terms, but the vendors don't agree to those terms.
It's not like they can decide not to take that client.
Yeah, absolutely. But right. if a production company wants to do work, they've got terms that they want addressed. And so the agency has to deal with that. It doesn't get transferred, but maybe there's a way to do it. But you've got production companies who can't even afford to take work on because their line of credit doesn't exist. So they're literally turning down work because they can't.
Nor should they have to have the line of credit.
Well, you start with a line of credit. Exactly. So no, this is an endemic problem that we could wonder, how did it get to this point? Is it going to get better? What solutions are out there? Who could come to the table and make this better? Well, this is a good start. What a diverse group. I am literally honored to be. I saw the list, Michael. I mean, I am literally honored to be even a part of this today. So thank you for the invite. And I'm just so grateful that everyone was, signed on. Maybe this is the start of something new.
You're welcome. And I think that's a great place to bring everybody in, actually. I'm going to turn the other kind of view on so that people can see who's there. People have their cameras off and they're on. But if there are questions out there in the world, go ahead, do this, because I find that raising your hand in the Zoom world, I don't see it. But if anybody has a question, just wave their hand in front of it. I'll start by asking a question while I'm waiting for somebody. People are talking about the idea that now there's almost two types of production. There's the agency that owns the production company, owns the edit company. There's that world that's sort of coming into one, which means a production consultant has a harder job in a sense because you're talking to the same people. And then there's also these sort of big conglomerate sort of companies that are sort of taking over from the agency, that are sort of taking it over and then actually starting to do the creative work. How do those play into the world that we're facing right now, Paul?
Mike, can I just ask one question?
Oh, yeah.
Sure. For the second part, did you mean specifically there are brands that have their own in-house agencies?
both brands and agencies that have in-house production, that are people who are sort of pulling all the stuff that used to be done
Right.
in separate places are now bringing it together, whether it's the agency or the brand or these international conglomerates that are actually putting together
That's what I was asking you about. Is it define what you mean by an internet name?
I'm guessing like Craft or Prodigious or things like that. Kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well, just with anything else, I could speak to at least my limited tenure as CEO of Prodigious New York. The Publicis Group production agency. The conceit was that the Publicis Group at the time had defined this mission to establish a production agency vertical. Years ago when they spun off the media from the agencies, they created a media agency vertical, and then they had the creative agency vertical, and they intended to have a production agency where all the agencies in the holding company would have production consolidated with that production agency. And so all the agencies in a region like New York or the Midwest all the producers would be reporting into this, and they would be able to buy more efficiently, produce more efficiently. No one really cleared that with the agencies, though. No one said we're going to let that. So that didn't, I don't think that model is going to go very well. Kraft, on the other hand, has done a great job, in my opinion, because they basically rebranded all the internal McCann studios, and boom, it's Kraft. The colleagues were all the same. The work. So there are ways to do it. Of course, there's other great success stories in this space. Smaller companies, not everything is Hogarth, but as far as a cost consultant, we're not necessarily treating them any differently than any other production company if we're looking at quotes and stuff.
Good to know. Toby, you have a question.
Hey, Toby.
Yeah. Hi, Paul. How are you? So I focused a question earlier. This is very much about primary production. But as you know, most of what I've been doing has been global adaptation and production for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And now we're starting to see a situation where clients, in fact, even ad agency creatives aren't ever seeing what they think they shot. Because ultimately what happens is it's a series of atomic elements which are getting put together by a production agency based on a brief which is either regional or local in order to cut out the 200 or 300 ad agencies that are being used around the world.
Are you talking about versioning?
Yeah.
Well, no, because it is versioning, but there's also a lot of primary production being done by Hogarth, Kraft. Look at where Accenture Digital is. It's probably the only company in the world who has a complete end-to-end relationship between the CEO and the producer.
Right.
Because they own Droga 5, they own Creative Drive, and they've got their CEO access, which most ad agencies, even the big network ones, have lost a long time.
Not even close. Absolutely.
The world has changed enormously. Now it's not just versioning, it is shooting some footage, which will then be cut by a production agency rather than production company, shall we call it that?
Right.
And so not a frame store or not a, whoever. And that work is then being produced by a production agency and translated in real time into hundreds of different versions.
And are they saving money that way? That's a good question.
Oh, yeah.
I think they are.
Oh, yeah.
The European Pfizer spent from 23 million to 8.5 million, and we delivered more assets.
Right. I mean, so that's a case study that we've seen time and again. And we reached a point with certain of our products within Unilever that we would ask our agencies to simply just shoot components. TAG, I think, was doing it at the time, or Redworks, I forgot. But we were just shooting components. So I would have producers gathering, just shooting components of ads. Yeah, we'd have a rough idea of how they were going to be put together, but all the components would be delivered to the production agency. They would be, handle the entire thing and the distribution and the translations and everything. And we would save a boatload because you weren't dealing with agency fees handling each one of these things in 72 different markets. So
this is a good thing, actually. I mean, for a company, they want to save money and get it sufficient.
It's fine for everyone, but in ad agencies, bottom line, because they can't charge 12 million euros to handle a global account anymore because simply producing components and handing it off. Now, if they own the production agency, that's a different story, but still they're not, the client is still going to get a better deal. All things there were some problems that we had when Unilever was just standing this up, when a client would do this and he would have it automated and, he would want 10 versions of this thing. He would just hit 10 on the computer and it would be 10 times 8,000 euros. Well, wouldn't really be that, because if you were doing it in one session, but that was early days. Right. But it was, the intent was there and we knew where it was heading. Again, eliminating us. why do you have a production consultant when you've automated this process? You've got a great deal with Kraft or Hogarth or, some of these other great shops, and you could negotiate very effectively with them because they've got a global remit. I mean, where do you get that? You don't. Even clients don't have that kind of oversight. So
I think we probably have 5 or 10 more minutes. If anybody else has any questions out there. Thomas, did you have a question? I saw some notes from you. Oh, you're on mute, Tom.
No, I was just hoping we'd open it up. I don't have any questions because I'm pretty stupid about this stuff, but there's 45 people out here. I hope there's some questions of these guys who are obviously at the top of the game with this. So
I've got the list.
You know who I am.
There's a question here in the.
Okay, Ronald has a. Oh, was that Ronald that I heard?
Roland. Yeah.
Hold on.
Hey.
Roland, sorry.
Hey there. I wanted to know how often Paul, how often your work ends up directly in contact with the production company, because it feels like it is very much that kind of, there's that wall between the kind of the producers on the agency side, along with the production consultant, and then the production team on the other side trying to get the work done. And it's all a game of telephone. So I was kind of curious about that.
Well, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because there were many occasions when we'd be asked to, not by many producers, but some producers just lost patience and said, why don't you just deal with the production company? And I'd be like, sure. Okay, but if I negotiate this, then I'm going to have to produce it because I'm going to have to deliver it, right? So at least be on the call. And when it comes to learning and coaching, again, back to Jonathan's point about Benton and Bowles, I would often find myself in the position, again, I'm not the only production consultant who does this. And when there are maybe some less experienced producers who still don't understand the basics, but they can't go to their boss or they can't go to the business manager, and they're still kind of figuring out their way. So I can't tell you how many times I explained the difference between a firm bid and a cost plus job, or why we do it this way. So if they didn't really have if they didn't think it was in their job description to negotiate, they were creative producers and they didn't really want to deal with that part, and there was no one else to do it, and they throw it over to me, fine, but be on the phone, because you're going to own this when we agree with it. So if I'm talking to an EP and I'm like, can you walk me through the art department? What's $20,000 for greens? I don't get it. We're inside. What? Oh yeah, no, they want the creative person said he wanted to see 3 different dimensions of. Oh, okay, that's not in the board. How are you going to? So we have a conversation like that. So there are many times, but I could never negotiate. I certainly didn't negotiate directly with the production company. And I often didn't get a chance to talk to my friends who were bidding on a job, they would often want to know what was going on. And I couldn't. What really hurt me the most was when they never got a call when they didn't get the job. And they knew I was involved, and they would have to call me, and I would have to tell them, no, sorry, that didn't go your way, And again, I didn't know either, why it didn't happen. But so I there are times when I wish I could have just picked up the phone and called the EP who I've worked with for years, or the rep, or someone going, hey, what's going on? Or you must have gotten poorly briefed because you're $25,000, whatever, but we never really could. I don't think that's all.
Thanks for that question. That is a very good question. And,
Can I just respond a little bit, Michael? Do we have time?
Sure.
Because one of the things I'd like to say is, and I can again only speak for myself and the way I ran my production department. The young producers were never put in a position where they had to answer a question they couldn't answer. Because if they were presented with a question they didn't know the answer to, they had to come to either myself or any other senior producer for advice on how to deal with the situation. So I feel, and I thought this question was going to be asked, that a lot of times, and I'm not accusing you specifically, Paul, but there are those cost consultant businesses that perpetrate a lot of what I call mythology about the way production departments within the agency operate. And even though there is no longer training the way there used to be, and a lot of that's because the fees aren't what they used to be. So let's just own that.
Mm-hmm.
I always made sure that a young producer had a mentor who was overseeing the project they were doing. So
I think your point is really strong, actually, Jonathan. Education for producers, especially agency producers. I think that if the production world, I think if you If you don't learn it, you get fired. But in agencies, if they don't train you, how do they expect you to understand some of this stuff? And I think that you and I have talked about this. Training is sorely lacking in the agency world right now.
Though I'm disagreeing with you, Michael. I don't think it's as lacking as you're making it out to be.
Oh, I would have to.
Not as
I would have to
defined.
agree. I would have to agree. The biggest disservice agencies are doing is devaluing the role of the production department entirely, and I've seen that on a broad array in my experience.
Well, obviously, you're exposed to a lot more agencies than I am because I only have the agencies that I've worked at and the agencies that I've worked with.
Well, pretty stellar, Jonathan. We have to admit that McCann was probably one of the best, if not the best, at the time in New York, and you had a stellar. Yeah, I often presented to your colleagues because I was invited to present, which hardly ever happened anywhere else. So that was a huge thing.
Carrie's got a question. Carrie, who used to be my boss once upon a time.
Oh my gosh,
that's a long time ago.
That was in 1962. when you were 12 years old.
I was 12.
It's interesting what you say about the value of the producer's role at the agency. But this has been going on for my long career. This has been going on. It started at Leo Burnett probably in the late 70s, for sure the early 80s, because the creatives kind of took over everything. Hence, Paul's problem, Jonathan's problem about everything, about not being able to go back to a client and say, we really have to kind of reconcept this to go back and fit it into a predetermined budget. Mm-hmm. And when you think about it, when it comes down to production, and I always come from the production side, you are, when you get out of an agency producer, like, what is it you really have to spend? And they say, well, I have 200 or 300, or I've got 75,000. And on the production side, you look at that and you go, okay, I can make that work in my city, or I can't make that work. And then it's just going to come down to the director pick if everybody's at the same production level. And Paul, if you say you're not looking at line by line, and of course, the disservice for the agency is sometimes they're going by the director and they're not really looking at the production company to see if the production company could really handle it, regardless of their, cash flow or all the issues that, the agency wouldn't know about unless they work with them on a long-term basis. So I think for the group, I think I see Paulette's here, and Paulette's doing great production consulting these days. And I've known Paulette for a long time. It's really interesting, but as long as there are, and I think I said it in the chat, as long as there are MBA type clients out there, brand directors who are the clients of the advertising agencies, there will always be cost consultants. They'll never go away. And the role has expanded dramatically from that, let's just save 10% and we'll take our percentage, which came out of Detroit and New York in the early days of cost consulting.
Right.
But in reality now, look at APR was mentioned. I mean, These are huge international, but they're not just working on that one little production cost, whether we can make 300,000 or 500,000. They're doing that vertical thing of taking it from, soup to nuts, and how can we leverage, this one commercial into everything we're doing internationally for,
which is why they're no longer, which is, I think it's a good way to end this, because I think that sort of says it's why Paul said it's not about cost consultants, about production consultants, because if you can look at the big picture and bring it together, you might be able to save some real money. If you're looking at an individual line, you're going to save $50. And it doesn't mean anything to any of these advertisers.
It just pisses off the production companies.
And pisses off everybody.
A lot of tension there. Exactly. But again, to your point, that it's ironic that the agencies have allowed that the one dominant voice of production reason being heard by the client is from this production consultant and not from themselves, because it's become so fractured that every brand manager has 15 agencies lined up, at their door, shopper, marketing, digital, creative, media, all these people. Who do we listen to? How are we going to stitch together this production strategy? And so where I found it the most beneficial is that my clients, they care about money, but they more or less care about their time. That's their personal commodity, right? They saved some money. Okay, that's great. But how can I get this much done? How many more meetings do I have to avoid? So you'll see that cost consultants, production consultants, some sort of consultants like McKinsey hasn't gone away, and BCG hasn't gone away. And, there's a big role for consultancies, obviously, but not maybe in the early days. So we're seeing cost not be as as the emphasis is not necessarily on cost. Process is, but you improve process, chances are you'll save some money. So
I'm going to ask one last question, then we can end it. And because about 15 people put this in either the chat or in our questions, they think, and I think it's an incorrect thought. I think they think that you make your money by a percentage of the amount of money you save. I don't think that's true, but
no, there's a lot of production consultants would think that would be we'd love it. No doubt. I would just love to I would just take a flat percentage of everything I save, and then I'd work with the agency to inflate every estimate, and I'd look like a genius. So no client in their right mind would compensate a production consultant based on percentages. A lot of them say that we will guarantee that we'll save you at least our fee, so it's cost neutral. Some guys say that, we'll guarantee, we've seen savings of 3 to 4% over. So there's always going to be something like that in there. We don't, obviously, because we would rather, we would end up disappointing clients sometimes, and I don't want to be in a position to do that. So, when I was coming up, I was trying my best to get a percentage, and everyone just said, "Go, forget it, there's no way." If anyone's doing it, well done. If anyone's on this call doing it, great job.
Thank you for clearing that up. And thank you,
after the meeting, so you can figure out how to do it.
Oh yeah, Michael, please send my email. I know there are a lot of questions that people had asked and we didn't get to, but I would be more than happy to answer any question that was sent in. Thank you for submitting those questions. I'd be more than happy to address any of them, but I don't have anyone's contact information.
Fantastic. And I really didn't have time to let you talk about your new endeavor, which just a big announcement came up. But
getting a lot of press.
You'll have to address that one in the next Zoom. Guys, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you for joining. This has been really interesting and exciting. So I appreciate it. And I'm going to turn off the recording.
Can I just say thank you as well to everybody. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Paul, thank you so much for participating.
Thank you, Jonathan. Always good to hang out, as you know.